Hey, this is Kim, the CEO of TecHive, and we're going to try something a little bit different. I'm going to read you this awesome article from The Atlantic about how artificial intelligence is actually misreading human emotion. I take no credit for this. Kate Crawford is an incredible journalist, and so I am just going to pay homage to The Atlantic and Kate and read this for you. So feel free to go on audio. I'll also be scrolling through the page so you can read along with me. Artificial intelligence is misreading human emotion. There is no good evidence that facial expressions reveal a person's feelings, but big tech companies want you to believe otherwise. By Kate Crawford. At a remote outpost in the mountainous highlands of Papua New Guinea, a young American psychologist named Paul Ekman arrived with a collection of flashcards and a new theory. It was 1967, and Ekman had heard that the Four people of Okapa were so isolated from the wider world that they would be his ideal test subjects. Like Western researchers before him, Ekman had come to Papua New Guinea to extract data from the indigenous community. He was gathering evidence to bolster a controversial hypothesis that all humans exhibit a small number of universal emotions, or affects, that are innate and the same all over the world. For more than half a century, this claim has remained contentious, disputed among psychologists, anthropologists, and technologists. Nonetheless, it became a seed for a growing market that will be worth an estimated $56 billion in 2024. This is the story of how affect recognition came to be a part of the artificial intelligence industry and the problems that persist with it. When Ekman arrived on the tropics of Okapa, he ran experiments to assess how the foray recognized emotions. Because the foray had minimal contact with Westerners and mass media, Ekman had theorized that the recognition and display of core expressions would prove that such expressions were universal. His method was simple. He would show them flashcards of facial expressions and see if they could describe the emotion as he did. In his own words, quote, "All I was doing was showing funny pictures." But Ekman had no training in foray history, language, culture, or politics. I should note as an aside, I believe it's pronounced foray, but I'm not sure. So if anyone actually knows, please feel free to correct me on any pronunciations. His attempts to conduct his flashcard experiments using translators floundered. He and his subjects were exhausted by the process, which he described as like pulling teeth. Ekman left Papua New Guinea frustrated at his first attempt at cross-cultural research on emotional expression, but this would just be the beginning. Today, affect recognition tools can be found in national security systems and at airports, in education and hiring startups, in software that purports to detect psychiatric illness, and policing programs that claim to predict evidence. The claim that a person's interior state can be accurately assessed by analyzing the person's face is premised on shaky evidence. A 2019 systematic review of the scientific literature on inferring emotions from facial movements, led by psychologist and neuroscientist Lisa Feldman Barrett, found that there is no reliable evidence that you can accurately predict someone's emotional state in this manner. It is not possible to confidently infer happiness from a smile, anger from a scowl, or sadness from a frown, as much as current technology tries to do when applying what are mistakenly believed to be scientific facts, the study concludes. So why has the idea that there has been a small set of universal emotions readily interpreted from a person's face become so accepted in the AI field? To understand that requires tracing the complex history and incentives behind how these ideas developed, long before AI emotion detection tools were built into the infrastructure of everyday life. The idea of automated affect recognition is as compelling as it is lucrative. Technology companies have captured immense volumes of surface-level imagery of human expressions, including billions of Instagram selfies, Pinterest portraits, TikTok videos, and Flickr photos. Much like facial recognition, affect recognition has become part of the core infrastructure of many platforms, from the biggest tech companies to the smallest startups. Whereas facial recognition attempts to identify a particular individual, affect recognition aims to detect and classify emotions by analyzing any face. These systems readily influence how people behave and how social institutions operate, despite a lack of substantial scientific evidence that they work. Automated effect detection systems are now widely deployed, particularly in hiring. The AI hiring company HireVue, which can list Goldman Sachs, Intel, and Unilever among its clients, uses machine learning to infer people's suitability for a job. In 2014, the company launched its AI system to extract micro-expressions, tone of voice, and other variables from video job interviews, which it used to compare job applicants against the company's top performers. After considerable criticism from scholars and civil rights groups, it dropped the facial analysis, but kept vocal tone as an assessment criterion. In January 2016, Apple acquired the startup Emotin, which claimed to have produced software capable of detecting emotions from images of faces. Perhaps the largest of these startups is Affectiva, a company based in Boston that has emerged from academic work done at MIT. Affectiva has coded a variety of emotion-related applications, primarily using deep learning techniques. These approaches include detecting distracted and risky drivers on the roads, should say risky is in quotes, measuring consumers' emotional responses to advertising. The company has built what it calls the world's largest emotion database, made up of more than 10 million people's expressions from 87 countries. Its monumental collection of videos was hand-labeled by crowd workers based primarily in Cairo. Outside the startup sector, AI giants like Amazon, Microsoft, and IBM have all designed systems for emotion detection. Microsoft offers perceived emotion detection in its Face API, identifying anger, contempt, disgust, fear, happiness, neutral, sadness, and surprise, while Amazon's Recognition with a K tool similarly proclaims that it can identify what it characterizes as, quote, all 7 emotions, and, quote, measure how these things change over time, such as constructing a timeline of the emotions of an actor, end quote. Emotion recognition systems share a similar set of blueprints and founding assumptions: that there is a small number of distinct and universal emotional categories, that we all involuntarily reveal these emotions in our faces, and that they can be detected by machines. These articles of faith are so accepted in some fields that it can seem strange to even notice them, let alone question them. But if we look at how emotions came to be taxonomized, neatly ordered and labeled, we see that questions are in every corner. Ekman's research began with a fortunate encounter with Sylvan Tompkins, then an established psychologist at Princeton who had published the first volume of his magnum opus, Affect Imagery Consciousness, in 1962. Tompkins' work on affect had a huge influence on Ekman, who devoted much of his career to studying its implications. One aspect in particular played an outsized role: the idea that if effects are an innate set of evolutionary responses, they would be universal and thus recognizable across cultures. This desire for universality had an important bearing on why this theory is widely applied in AI and motion recognition systems today. The theory could be applied everywhere, a simplification of complexity that is easily replicable at scale. The introduction to Affect Imagery Consciousness, Tompkins framed his theory of biologically based universal effects as one addressing an acute crisis of human sovereignty. He was challenging the development of behaviorism and psychoanalysis, 2 schools of thought that he believed treated consciousness as a mere byproduct that was in service to other forces. He noted that human consciousness had been challenged and reduced again and again by first Copernicus, Copernicus displaced man from being the center of the universe, to then, quote, by Darwin, end quote, whose theory of evolution shattered the idea that humans were created in the image of a Christian God. And most of all by Freud, who decentered human consciousness and reason as the driving forces behind our motivations. Tompkins continued, the paradox of maximal control over nature and minimal control over human nature is in part a derivative of neglect of the role of consciousness as a control mechanism. Okay, so to put it simply, consciousness tells us little about why we feel and act the way we do. This is a crucial claim for all sorts of later applications of affect theory, which stress that the inability of humans to recognize both the feeling and expression of affects. If we as humans are incapable of truly detecting what we are feeling, then perhaps AI systems can do it for us. This is a footnote. That was a really intense paragraph. Felt like I was back in college reading a lecture. Okay, back to the article. Tompkins' theory of effects was his way to address the problem of human motivation. He argued that motivation was governed by two systems, affects and drives. Tompkins proposed that drives tend to be closely associated with immediate biological needs like hunger and thirst. They're instrumental. The pain of hunger can be remedied with food. But the primary system governing human emotion and behavior is that of affects, involving positive and negative feelings. Affects, which play the most important role in human motivation, amplify drive signals, but they are much more complex. For example, it is difficult to know the precise causes that lead a baby to cry, expressing the distress anguish effect. How do we know anything about a system in which connections between cause and effect, stimulus and response are so tenuous and uncertain? Tompkins, again, this is in the 60s, proposed an answer. Quote, the primary effects seem to be innately related in a one-to-one fashion with an organ system which is extraordinarily visible, end quote, namely our face. He found precedents for this emphasis on facial expression in two works published in the 19th century. So Darwin's book, The Expression of the Emotions in Man and Animals from 1872, and an obscure volume by the French neurologist Guillaume Benjamin Ahmad Duchesne de Bouillon from 1862. I am so sorry. I have no idea. My French is horrible. Tompkins assumed that facial display of effects was a universal human trait. Effects, he believed, are sets of muscles, vascular, and glandular responses located in the face and widely distributed throughout the body, which generate sensory feedback. So these organized sets of responses are triggered at subcortical centers where specific programs for distinct effect are stored. A very early use of the idea of our brains being computers, a computational metaphor for human system. But Tompkins acknowledged that the interpretation of affective displays depends on the individual, the social, and the cultural factors. He admitted that there were very different dialects of facial language in different societies. Even the forefather of affect research raised the probability that interpreting facial displays depends on social and cultural context. Love that. Given facial expressions are culturally variable, using them to train machine learning systems would inevitably mix together all sorts of different contexts and signals and expectations. The problem from Ekman and later for the field of computer vision was how to reconcile all these tensions. During the mid-1960s, opportunity knocked at his door in the form of a large grant from what is now called DARPA, the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, the research arm of the Department of Defense. DARPA's sizable financial support allowed Ekman to begin his first studies to prove universality in facial recognition. In general, these studies followed a design that would be copied in early AI labs. He largely duplicated Tompkins' methods, even using Tompkins' photographs to test subjects in Chile, Argentina, Brazil, and the United States and Japan. Subjects were presented with photographs of posed facial expressions selected by the designers, exemplifying or expressing a particularly pure effect, such as fear, surprise, anger, happiness, sadness, and disgust. Subjects were then asked to choose among these affect categories and label the posed image. The analysis measured the degree to which the labels chosen by the subjects correlated with those chosen by the designers. Timeout. In other words, someone picked pictures of what they decided was happy, and then they tested to see if the other person who saw it decided it was also happy. From the start, the methodology had problems. Naturally. Ekman's forced choice response format would be criticized for alerting subjects to the connections that designers had already made between facial expressions and emotions. Further, the fact that these emotions were faked would raise questions about the validity of results. The idea that interior states can be reliably inferred from external signs has a long history. It stems in part from the history of physiognomy, which was premised on studying a person's facial features for indications of his character. Aristotle believed that, quote, it is possible to judge men's character from their physical appearance, for it has been assumed that body and soul are affected together, end quote. Yeah. The Greeks also used physiognomy as an early form of racial classification, applied to the genus man himself, dividing him into races, insofar as they differ in appearance and character. For example, Egyptians, Thracians, and Scythians. Physiognomy in Western culture reached a high point during the 18th and 19th centuries when it was seen as part of the anatomical sciences. A key figure in this tradition was the Swiss pastor Johann Caspar Lavater, who wrote essays on physiognomy for the promotion of knowledge and the love of mankind, published in German in 1789. He took the approaches of physiognomy and blended them with the latest scientific knowledge. He believed that bone structure was the connection between physical appearance and character type. This is an aside. I wonder how many of these ideas still play out today, that we think that attractive people are better people. If facial expressions were fleeting, skulls seemed to offer more solid material for their inferences. Skull measurement was a popular technique in race science, which is not a science and highly debunked, as an aside, and was used to support nationalism, white supremacy, and xenophobia. Case in point. This work was famously elaborated by these individuals. It was the French neurologist Duchamp, described by Ekman as a marvelously gifted observer, who codified the use of photography and other technical means to study human faces. In his book, Mécanisme de la physionomie humaine, Duchamp laid important foundations for both Darwin and Ekman, connecting older ideas from physiognomy and phrenology with more modern investigations into physiology and psychology. He replaced vague assertions about character with more limited investigation into expression and interior mental and emotional states. Duchamp worked in Paris at an asylum, which housed up to 5,000 people with a wide range of mental illnesses and neurological conditions. Some would become his subjects for very distressing experiments, part of the long tradition of medical and technological experimentation on the most vulnerable, those who cannot refuse. Duchamp, who was little known in the scientific community, decided to develop techniques of electrical shocks to stimulate isolated muscle movements in people's faces. This is another aside. It's difficult to know that we did this not too long ago, but it's so important that we understand the foundations and roots of modern day thinking and AI technology theory, because this is a huge foundation of why things are unequal. His aim was to build a more complete anatomical and physiological understanding of the face. He used these methods to bridge the new psychological science, the much older study of physiognomic signs or passions. He relied on the latest photographic enhancements, such as collidon processing, which allowed for shorter exposure times, enabling him to freeze fleeting muscular movements and facial expressions. Even at these early stages, the faces were never natural or socially occurring human expressions, but simulations produced by the brute application of electricity to muscles. Regardless, he believed that the use of photography and other technical systems would transform this squishy business of representation into something objective and evidentiary, more suitable for scientific study. Darwin praised his magnificent photographs and included reproductions in his own work. Yeah, these are super strange and sad and disturbing, knowing that they were generated by electricity. That's my own commentary. Ekman would follow him in placing photography at the center of his experimental practice. He believed that slow motion photography was essential to his approach, because many facial expressions operates at the limits of human perception. The aim was to find so-called micro-expressions, One of Ekman's ambitious plans in his early research was to codify a system for detecting and analyzing facial expressions. In 1971, he co-published a description of what he called FAST, Facial Effect Scoring Technique. Relying on posed photographs, the approach used 6 basic emotional types largely derived from Ekman's intuitions. FAST soon ran into problems when other scientists encountered facial expressions not included in his typography. So Ekman decided to ground his next measurement tool in facial musculature, harkening back to Dushman's original electroshock studies. He identified roughly 40 distinct muscular contractions in the face and called the basic components of each expression an action unit. After some testing and validation, Ekman and Wallace Friesen published the Facial Action Coding System, FACS. In 1978, updated editions continue to be widely used. Hang in there, folks. We're almost done. Despite its financial success, FACS was very labor-intensive to use. Ekman wrote that it took 75 to 100 hours to train users in the methodology and an hour to score a single minute of facial footage. This challenge presented exactly the type of opportunity that the emerging field of computer vision was hungry to take on. Fix a problem with a problem. As work into the use of computers and effect recognition began to take shape, researchers recognized the need for a collection of standardized images to experiment with. In 1992, a National Science Foundation report co-written by Ekman commended that a readily accessible multimedia database shared by the diverse facial research community would be an important resource for the resolution and extension of issues concerning facial understanding. Within a year, the Department of Defense began funding a program to collect facial photographs. By the end of the decade, this is the end of the 1990s, machine learning researchers had started to assemble, label, and make public the data sets that drive much of today's machine learning research. Academic labs and companies worked on parallel projects, creating scores of photo databases. For example, researchers in a lab in Sweden created Karolinska directed emotional faces. This database comprises images of individuals portraying posed emotional expressions corresponding to Ekman's categories. They made their faces into the shapes that accord with 6 basic emotional states: joy, anger, disgust, sadness, surprise, and fear. When looking at this training sense, it is difficult not to be struck by a sense of pantomime. Incredible surprise, abundant joy, paralyzing fear. These subjects are literally making machine-readable emotion. Here are images if you're watching this video. I don't think this looks like fear. As the field grew in scale and complexity, so did the types of photographs used in facial and effect recognition. Researchers began using the FACS system to label data generated not from posed expressions but from spontaneous facial expressions, sometimes gathered outside of the laboratory conditions. Ekman's work had profound and wide-ranging influence. The New York Times described Ekman as the world's most famous face reader, and Time named him one of the 100 most influential people in the world. He would eventually consult with clients as disparate as the Dalai Lama, the FBI, the CIA, the Secret Service, the animation studio Pixar, which wanted to create more lifelike renderings of cartoon faces. His ideas became part of pop culture, including bestsellers such as Malcolm Gladwell's Blink and a television drama Lie to Me, in which Ekman was a consultant for the lead character's role, apparently loosely based on him. His business prospered. Ekman sold techniques of deception detection to agencies such as the Transportation Security Administration, which used them to develop screening of passengers by observation techniques, SPOT. SPOT has been used to monitor air travelers' facial expressions since the September 11th attacks in an attempt to automatically detect terrorists. It's probably by a bunch of random people always get stopped and they don't know why. The system uses a set of 94 criteria, all of which are allegedly signs of stress, fear, or deception. But looking for these responses means that some groups are immediately disadvantaged. Anyone who is stressed, is uncomfortable under questioning, or has negative experiences with police and border guards can score high. This creates its own form of racial profiling. The SPOT program has been criticized by the Government Accountability Office, civil liberties groups for its racial bias and lack of scientific methodology. Despite its $900 million price tag, there is no evidence that it's produced clear success. As Ekman's fame spread, so did the skepticism of his work, with critiques emerging from a number of fields. An early critic was the cultural anthropologist Margaret Mead, who debated Ekman on the question of universality of emotions in the late 60s. Mead was unconvinced by his belief in universal biological determinants of behavior that exist separately from conditioned cultural factors. Scientists from different fields joined the course over the decades. In more recent years, psychologists James Russell, Jose Miguel Fernandez-Doles have shown that the most basic aspects of the science remain uncertain. Perhaps the foremost critic is the historian of science Ruth Lays, who sees a fundamental circularity in Ekman's method. The posed or simulated photographs he used were assumed to express a set of basic affective states that were, as Lays wrote, free of cultural influence. These photographs were then used to elicit labels from different populations to demonstrate the universality of facial expressions. The psychologist and neuroscientist Lisa Feldman Barrett puts it bluntly, quote, companies can say whatever they want, but the data are clear. They can detect a scowl, but that's not the same thing as detecting anger. I'm going to say that one more time. You can detect a scowl, but that doesn't mean you're detecting the emotion of anger. More troubling still is that the field of study of emotions, researchers have not reached consensus about what an emotion actually is. What emotions are, how they are formulated within us and expressed, what their physiological or neurological functions would be, their relation to stimuli, all of this is stubbornly unsettled. Why, with so many critiques, has the approach of reading emotions from a person's face endured? Since the 1960s, driven by significant Department of Defense funding, multiple systems have been developed that are more and more accurate at measuring facial movements. Ekman's theory seemed ideal for computer vision because it could be automated at scale. The theory fit what the tools could do. Almost over. Powerful institutional and corporate investments have been made based on the perceived validity of Ekman's theories and methodologies, recognizing that emotions are not easily classified, nor that they are not reliably detectable from facial expressions could undermine an expanding industry. Many machine learning papers cite Ekman as though these issues are resolved before directly proceeding into engineering challenges. The more complex issues of context, conditioning, relationality, and culture are often ignored. Ekman himself has said he is concerned about how his ideas are being commercialized, but when he has written to tech companies asking for evidence that their emotion recognition programs work, he has received no reply. Instead of trying to build more systems that group expressions into machine-readable categories, we should question the origins of the categories themselves, as well as their social and political consequences. For example, these systems are known to flag the speech effects of women, particularly Black women, differently from those of men. A study conducted at the University of Maryland shows that some facial recognition software interprets Black faces as having more negative emotion than white faces, specifically registering them as angry and more contemptuous, even when they control for their degree of smiling, meaning the system is broken. That's my commentary. It is not an implication that the systems are right. It means the underlying is broken. This is the danger of automating emotion recognition. These tools can take us back to the phrenological past when spurless claims were used to support existing systems of power. The decades of scientific controversy around inferring emotional states consistently from a person's face underscores a central point, that one-size-fits-all detection is not the right approach. Emotions are complicated and they develop and change in relation to our cultures and histories, all of the manifold contexts that live outside of the AI frame. But already, job applicants are judged unfairly because of their facial expressions or vocal tones don't match those of other employees. Students are flagged at school because their faces appear angry, and customers are questioned because their facial cues indicate that they may be shoplifters. These are the people who will bear the cost of a system that are not just technically imperfect, but based on questionable methodologies. A narrow taxonomy of emotions grown from one-man Ekman's initial experiments, is being coded into machine learning systems as a proxy for the infinite complexity of emotional experience in the world. A narrow taxonomy of emotions, grown from Ekman's initial experiments, is being coded into machine learning systems as a proxy for the infinite complexity of emotional experiences in the world. I would love to know your takeaway, not only of this experience. Do you like this? Would you like me to read more of my favorite articles? My perspective is that we need more anthropologists, sociologists on our data science teams to question the methodologies that they're using before, as the author Kate wrote, we're actually solving engineering issues on how to use them. Is the system the right system from the beginning? Thank you so much. Have a beautiful day, and I hope to see you all again soon.